The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the university lecture hall as Professor Claire Emerson gathered her papers, her mind already drifting to the stack of essays waiting to be graded at home. At 42, she was at the peak of her career, respected in her field of literature, admired by her students, and comfortably settled into the rhythms of academic life. As the last of her students filed out, a young man lingered, approaching her desk with a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Professor Emerson, I was hoping I could talk to you about my thesis proposal." Claire looked up, recognizing him as Ethan Foster, one of her most promising students. At 22, he had a keen intellect that set him apart from his peers, along with a quiet intensity that had caught her attention from the first day of class. "Of course, Ethan. What's on your mind?" As he began to outline his ideas, Claire found herself drawn in by his passion and insight. What was meant to be a brief conversation stretched into an hour, then two, as they debated literary theory and shared favourite passages from obscure novels. The fading light outside went unnoticed as they lost themselves in intellectual discourse. It wasn't until the janitor poked his head in, surprised to find anyone still there, that they realised how much time had passed. Flustered, Claire gathered her things, acutely aware of a strange tension that hadn't been there before. As they walked out into the cool evening air, she felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest when Ethan's hand brushed against hers. "Thank you for taking the time, Professor," he said softly. "I feel like I could talk to you for hours." "Me too," Claire admitted, then quickly added, "About literature, of course. Your ideas are very promising, Ethan. Keep developing them, and I'm sure your thesis will be excellent." He smiled, holding her gaze for a moment longer than necessary before bidding her good night. As Claire watched him walk away, she tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that something had shifted between them. She was his professor, more than old enough to be his mother. Whatever spark she'd felt was surely just the excitement of intellectual connection, nothing more. But in the weeks that followed, Claire found her thoughts returning to Ethan with increasing frequency. She looked forward to his insightful comments in class, found herself lingering after lectures in hopes he'd approach her with another question. When their eyes met across the classroom, she felt a jolt of electricity that both thrilled and terrified her. It was after a particularly heated class discussion that things came to a head. As the other students filed out, Ethan approached her desk, his eyes bright with passion. "Professor Emerson, I have to tell you, the way you defended Woolf's use of stream of consciousness was brilliant. I've never met anyone who understands literature the way you do." Claire felt herself blushing at the intensity of his gaze. "Thank you, Ethan. Your counter-arguments were quite compelling as well. You have a real gift for analysis." "I was wondering," he said, a hint of nervousness creeping into his voice, "if you might be willing to get coffee sometime, to discuss books, of course. There's so much more I want to learn from you." She knew she should refuse. It was inappropriate, a line that shouldn't be crossed. But the words that came out of her mouth surprised her. "That sounds lovely, Ethan. Why don't we meet at the cafe on Main Street this Saturday?" The moment the words left her lips, Claire knew she was stepping onto dangerous ground. But the smile that lit up Ethan's face made her heart skip a beat, and she couldn't bring herself to take it back. Saturday arrived with agonizing slowness. Claire spent far too long agonizing over her outfit, wanting to look professional but not dowdy. When she arrived at the cafe, her stomach was in knots. But as soon as she saw Ethan waiting for her, a sense of calm washed over her. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, ranging from obscure poets to childhood memories. Claire was struck by Ethan's emotional maturity, the depth of thought behind his youthful exterior. For his part, Ethan seemed captivated by her every word, leaning in close as if to absorb her very essence. As the afternoon wore on, their hands inched closer across the table until their fingers were nearly touching. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. When Ethan's pinky brushed against hers, Claire felt a jolt of electricity race through her body. "We shouldn't be doing this," she murmured, even as she made no move to pull her hand away. "I know," Ethan replied softly. "But I can't help how I feel about you, Claire. You're the most fascinating woman I've ever met." The use of her first name, so intimate and forbidden, broke something open inside her. Without conscious thought, Claire found herself leaning across the table, her lips meeting Ethan's in a kiss that sent shockwaves through her entire being. It lasted only a moment before reality came crashing back. Claire jerked away, her face burning with shame and desire. "I'm so sorry," she stammered. "This was a mistake. I should go." She fled the cafe, her heart pounding, leaving a stunned Ethan in her wake. That night, alone in her bed, Claire berated herself for her lack of self-control. She was Ethan's professor, for God's sake. She had a responsibility to maintain appropriate boundaries. And yet, every time she closed her eyes, all she could see was his face, feel the softness of his lips against hers. The next few weeks were torture. Claire did her best to maintain a professional distance in class, but she could feel Ethan's eyes on her constantly. The air between them hummed with unresolved tension. She told herself it would pass, that these forbidden feelings would fade if she just ignored them. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. At a faculty cocktail party, Claire found herself alone on a balcony, seeking a moment of quiet. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her until it was too late. "Hiding from the party?" Ethan's voice sent a shiver down her spine. She turned, startled. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" "I'm working as a server to make some extra money," he explained. "But I saw you come out here and I couldn't stay away. Claire, we need to talk about what happened." "There's nothing to talk about," she said firmly, even as her traitorous heart raced. "It was a mistake, one that can never happen again." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes blazing with intensity. "Don't tell me you didn't feel it too. This connection between us, it's real, Claire. I've never felt this way about anyone before." "I'm your professor," she protested weakly. "It's wrong." "Is it?" he challenged. "I'm not a child, Claire. I'm old enough to know my own mind and heart, and my heart wants you." Before she could formulate a response, he closed the distance between them, capturing her lips in a searing kiss. This time, Claire didn't pull away. She melted into him, all her carefully constructed walls crumbling in the face of overwhelming desire. It wasn't until they heard voices approaching that they sprang apart, both breathing heavily. "Meet me tomorrow," Ethan whispered urgently. "My place. Please, Claire, give us a chance." She knew she should refuse. But as she looked into his eyes, shining with hope and desire, Claire found herself nodding. "Text me the address," she murmured, then slipped back into the party, her head spinning. The next evening found Claire standing outside Ethan's modest apartment, her hand poised to knock. Every fibre of her being screamed that this was a terrible idea, that she should turn and run before it was too late. But the memory of his kiss, the longing she'd been fighting for weeks, propelled her forward. Ethan opened the door, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "You came," he breathed, pulling her inside and into his arms. This time there was no hesitation. Their lips met in a passionate frenzy, months of pent-up desire finally finding release. Clothes were shed as they stumbled towards the bedroom, hands roaming over newly exposed skin. Claire marvelled at the lean muscles of Ethan's torso, so different from the middle-aged men she was used to. For his part, Ethan worshipped every curve of her body, murmuring words of adoration against her skin. When they finally came together, it was with an intensity that took Claire's breath away. Ethan moved with the eager enthusiasm of youth, tempered by a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. She lost herself in the sensations, all thoughts of propriety and consequences forgotten in the face of overwhelming pleasure. Afterwards, as they lay tangled in sheets and each other, reality began to creep back in. "What are we doing, Ethan?" Claire whispered, tracing patterns on his chest. He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Following our hearts," he replied simply. "I know it's complicated, Claire, but what we have, it's special. I've never felt this way about anyone before." "I'm too old for you," she protested half-heartedly, You should be with someone your own age, someone you can build a future with. Ethan propped himself up on an elbow, looking at her intently. You're not too old. You're exactly who I want. Age is just a number, Claire. What matters is how we feel about each other. As much as she wanted to believe him, Claire couldn't shake the nagging doubts. It's not that simple. I'm your professor. If anyone found out, then we'll be discreet, he said firmly. I only have 1 semester left anyway. Once I graduate, there's nothing stopping us from being together openly. The rational part of Claire's mind knew there were 1,000 reasons why this was a bad idea. But as Ethan pulled her in for another passionate kiss, she found herself powerless to resist. They made love again, slower this time, savouring every touch and caress. In the weeks that followed, Claire and Ethan settled into a clandestine routine. In class, they maintained a strict professional distance, but stolen moments in her office, secret rendezvous at his apartment, became the highlights of Claire's week. She felt more alive than she had in years, rediscovering a passion she thought long dormant. But the secrecy began to take its toll. Claire lived in constant fear of discovery, jumping at every knock on her office door. She hated lying to her colleagues, making up excuses for her distraction and frequent absences. And a nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered that she was being foolish, that this affair could only end in heartbreak. Ethan, for his part, grew increasingly frustrated with the need for secrecy. He wanted to shout his love for Claire from the rooftops, to take her out on proper dates and introduce her to his friends. Their age difference didn't bother him in the slightest, but he could sense Claire's lingering insecurity. Things came to a head at the department's annual spring picnic. Claire had begged off attending, not trusting herself to maintain the facade of mere professor and student. But Ethan insisted on making an appearance, not wanting to arouse suspicion. She watched from across the lawn as he chatted easily with his classmates, looking carefree and impossibly young. A pretty girl from his cohort touched his arm, laughing at something he said, and Claire felt a stab of irrational jealousy. He's quite the charmer, isn't he? Claire started at the voice beside her, turning to see her colleague, Professor Jameson, watching Ethan with a knowing look. I'm sorry, she stammered, trying to keep her voice neutral. Jameson's eyes twinkled with amusement. Oh, come now, Claire. I've seen the way you look at each other. Don't worry, your secret's safe with me. But you might want to be a bit more careful. Not everyone would be so understanding. Claire felt the blood drain from her face. I don't know what you're talking about, she said stiffly. If you'll excuse me. She hurried away, her mind racing. If Jameson had noticed, who else might suspect? The thought of her relationship with Ethan becoming fodder for academic gossip made her feel physically ill. That night, she ended things with Ethan. It was one of the hardest things she'd ever done, watching the light die in his eyes as she explained all the reasons they couldn't be together. He argued passionately, swearing he didn't care what anyone thought, that their love was worth fighting for. But Claire stood firm, even as her heart shattered. The next few months were a special kind of hell. Seeing Ethan in class, watching him withdraw into himself, was almost more than Claire could bear. She threw herself into her work, taking on extra classes and committee assignments in an effort to stay busy. But nothing could fill the Ethan-shaped hole in her life. As the semester drew to a close, Claire steeled herself for their final goodbye. Ethan was set to graduate, to move on to a prestigious graduate program across the country. She told herself it was for the best, that the distance would help them both move on. But when Ethan walked across the stage to receive his diploma, their eyes met for a brief moment. The longing and regret Claire saw there nearly brought her to her knees. In that instant, she realised she'd made a terrible mistake. The reception afterward was a blur. Claire made her excuses and slipped away early, her mind racing. She drove aimlessly for hours, weighing the pros and cons before finally making a decision. She found herself outside Ethan's apartment, soaked to the skin from the sudden downpour. When he opened the door, still in his graduation robes, the look of shock on his face quickly gave way to hope. I was wrong, Claire blurted out before he could speak. I was scared, and I let other people's opinions matter more than what we have. But I can't let you go, Ethan. I love you. If you still want me, if you can forgive me for being such a coward." She never got to finish her sentence. Ethan pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her toes curl. When they finally came up for air, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he murmured. "God, Claire, these past few months have been torture. Promise me you won't push me away again." "Never," she vowed. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." It wasn't going to be easy. There would be raised eyebrows, whispered comments, maybe even professional consequences. But as Claire looked into Ethan's eyes, she knew with absolute certainty that he was worth it. Age, social conventions, other people's opinions, none of it mattered. What they had was real, and she was done running from it. As Ethan led her to the bedroom, Claire felt a sense of coming home. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. And for the first time in months, she felt truly, completely happy.